Hey there, welcome to the Low Content Publishing for Beginners video series. My name's Rachel Harrison-Sund, and today we're going to be talking about using quotes in your low content books. I get a ton of questions about quotes, and it's not surprising, this is a super tricky area. So today I'm going to give you a few basic guidelines to follow. So obviously I am not a copyright or trademark lawyer, so if you want to get the final word on something particular, that is the person you should go to. But like I said, I'm just going to give you some basic guidelines to follow here just so you can stay out of trouble. So when we're talking about using quotes in your low content books, there are two main legal terms that you should be aware of. One is copyright and one is trademark, and they are related but different terms. So most people think that you can freely use a quote as long as you credit the author, and that is not accurate. And it's definitely not going to protect you if the real author of that quote comes knocking on your door and wants to pursue some legal action. Now, that is probably not likely to happen, but it is a little bit of a possibility. So a quote is actually intellectual property. So once the author of a quote has recorded that quote in any format, then that quote becomes protected by copyright law. So if you use somebody's quote on one of your journals, you are now profiting from someone else's intellectual property. So at a very base level, a lot of people would look at that as just being unethical, regardless of how likely it is that you're going to get caught or have legal action pursued. Now, having said that, you most likely aren't going to get into any real trouble as long as you properly attribute the author. But you do have to be prepared to remove the quote from any of the materials that you're selling if that author does come knocking on your door and say, I want you to stop using that quote. So the likely situation is that you would receive a cease and desist letter. So it's very unlikely that someone is just going to come barreling at you with a lawsuit. However, the possibility does exist, so you do kind of have to keep that in mind. So I realize I've kind of told you two different things here. On the one hand, I've told you that it's not technically legal to use someone else's quotes, but on the other hand, you're probably not going to get into any trouble doing so. So in order to clear things up a little bit further, if you're someone that really wants to play by the rules, here they are in their most basic form. So use a quote if, number one, it's in the public domain. So how do you know if something's in the public domain? Well, it's in the public domain if the person who originally said the quote has been dead for longer than 70 years. So a good example of this would be Shakespeare. He's been dead a really long time, so all of his quotes are completely fair game at this point. Another thing that's in the public domain are national anthems. So just like national flags, those cannot be copywritten, they are in the public domain. So any portion of a national anthem you are free to use. You can also use a quote if it is a generic phrase that can't really be pinned down to one particular person. So I'll give you an example of one that I used. I had a journal that was doing really well last year, and it said "get shit done" on the front of it. Now, when I first launched this book, there were a few others that had this phrase on it, and I think if you type that into Amazon now, probably hundreds will come up. This is obviously a very common phrase. Tons and tons of people are using it. So that would be really hard to pin down to one particular person. So if it's a common phrase that you can't really be attributed to anyone, then that is fair game as well. So when not to use a quote, don't use a quote if it is copyrighted. So you'll know there's a copyright on it if it's been recorded in any format. So we're talking about books, movies, TV shows, plays, speeches, commencement speeches. That's a good one. There's a lot of famous people doing commencement speeches these days, and obviously these speeches are full of really inspirational quotes. So sometimes you might see some of those quotes pulled out and put on, book covers or t-shirts or whatever, but this is a big no-no. It's been recorded, so therefore it is protected by copyright. So you really just kind of want to leave that one alone. Also, don't use a quote if it's been trademarked. So you'll know if a phrase has been trademarked by going to the USPTO database Now, this is just for the United States. This is the United States Patent and Trademark Office. So other countries will have their own version of this, but if you're selling the majority of your books in the American store, that is the database that you want to check for. If you're also making them available in Canada and the UK and whatnot, then be sure to check their own versions of the trademark database in whatever country you are looking to sell in. Now, I mentioned that once a quote has been recorded in any form, it's protected by copyright law. So that means that you don't actually have to apply for copyright law. It's just granted you by way of you recording it in any format. Now, trademark is a little bit different. There is an actual process that you have to go through in order to be granted a trademark, and that's done through the federal government. And once you obtain a trademark on a particular phrase, that has a lot more weight behind it. So while you can probably get away with using some quotes that have copyright behind them, you really don't want to go anywhere near ones that have been trademarked, because that can really make you vulnerable to having legal action taken against you. So I would just suggest, don't go anywhere near any of those things. So one example of this might be a particular catchphrase that a celebrity has said. So as an example, I'm sure we've all heard the "Let's get ready to rumble." That was said by Michael Buffer. It's a wrestling thing. I don't know who Michael Buffer is. I had to look up who said it. But that's a really good example of something that a kind of a well-known public figure said, and that quote has actually been trademarked. So no one's allowed to use that legally. So even if it's a catchphrase that you've heard a celebrity say, and it's something that you'd like to use on one of your journals, and you go and check out and see if it's been trademarked and it hasn't, I would still steer clear of that, because if that catchphrase becomes really, really popular, that celebrity is likely to then go back and apply for a trademark for it. And if they're granted that trademark, which they probably will be if they're the first one to have said that catchphrase, then you are making yourself vulnerable to potential legal action kind of in the future, even though you may have been using that phrase before it was trademarked. So I would steer clear of those as well. You'll also know not to use a quote if the person who said it is still alive or has been dead for less than 70 years. So in that situation, whatever they said is still legally protected by copyright. And then a final no-no here is never try to pass off someone else's quote as your own. So that's something that can actually get you in big trouble. So to wrap things up here, if you properly attribute the quote that you're using on your book to its original author, you most likely aren't going to get into any trouble. But the opportunity that you will get into trouble does still exist on a very small level. And probably what that will look like is a cease and desist letter. So, it's probably not going to be too serious. But it could. That possibility does exist, however small. So if you are someone that just wants to play completely by the rules, just follow the basic rules that I've just outlined. And by the way, I'll leave a couple of links to really useful articles in the description below, just so you can reference it back if you ever need to. Because some of these things can be kind of hard to remember in the moment, and there are kind of a lot of little pieces to it. So if you want something to reference back to, I will leave those links below. And in the meantime, hit subscribe if you want to keep receiving these videos. And again, you can always find more low content publishing tips on my website, rachelharrisonsun.com. And if you want the complete walkthrough from book idea right to hitting that publish button for the first time, then be sure to download my free guide, 3 Steps to Publishing Your First Low Content Book in Less Than a Day. And I will put that in the description below as well. See you next time, guys.